Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson. We're on module DD211. Understanding understanding politics, ideas, and institutions in a modern world. What influence youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs, going to better your life chance, your life skills, change diversity in your studies, in your academic studies. When you read, make sure you reference your reading. I'm not going to reference my reading now, but we know we're on module DD211. On chapter 19, culture, rights and justice in global politics. Human rights in a global arena. As you have already read in previous chapters, the modern rights movement has its origins in the traditional ideas and political theory of the late 18th century and the social reform movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Their subsequent enshrinement at the UN set universal standards for norms of conduct and treatment of individuals. Thus, when notions of rights and justice are extrapolated to the level of global politics, there can be a tension between the rights of individuals and the authority of states, as Brown of 2002, page 8, notes. On the one hand, most states do not want to be seen by their own publics or by world public opinion as mobilized by the international media as violators of human rights. On the other hand, when important issues are at stake, the states are unlikely to allow this kind of reputation to be decisive, and crucially, states themselves determine what are the important issues. The post-Westphalian state system maintained the sovereign equality of the states. Thus, they were responsible for their own laws. While the UN Declaration of Human Rights represents an attempt to assert rights of individuals within states, it still upholds the sovereign equality of those states. So it could be argued that the Declaration reinforces the power of the states to do so as they please within their own borders. An alternative reading of this might be it actually allows states to be held accountable to a wider international community, which, in an increasingly globalized world, adheres to common norms such as those enshrined in the UN Declaration. The international human rights discourse claims that the value of its conception of rights lies in it being universal, empowering and human-centered. The idea of universality asserts the relevance of human rights, a defense against inequality and the domination of the powerful over the weak. The human-centered feature of the international rights seeks to provide a perspective on global questions, putting the value of human dignity above the search of economic gain or the narrow interest of particular national governments. Chandler 2002, page 1. A key debate on the applicability of human rights in global politics is therefore over how these rights are granted. Should they be considered natural, basic human rights that transcend any country or culture? Or should they be considered as cultural and as emanating from within a specific culture? This leads us to debate over the viability of universal rights. And there are four useful critics which can be identified. Is a rights discourse truly universal? The cultural specificity of the current rights agenda cannot be easily overcome because it derives directly from an Enlightenment and modern, rational Western tradition and its accompanying context of emancipatory, progressive, liberal nationalist politics. Rights in this sense cannot simply be applied to other places and times. Reading international rights through the lens of Western concepts can lead to distorting effects. For instance, some critics have argued that there are unwarranted tendencies in both Europe and North America to see human rights as problems for other countries, but not for themselves, and to be complacent about poverty and institutionalized racism in the Western countries. Critics of rights notions in the West are often disregarded, yet deserve to be taken seriously. The criticisms from the Muslim groups, for instance, of the objectification of women's bodies and the power of the pornography industry in the West are a case in point. Feminist critics. Some feminists argue that the universal notion of rights makes invisible the special problems faced by women as a group, and that thereby specific articles of the various human rights declarations and conventions reinforce traditional gender roles in the family and the workplace. An example might be the poor pay and conditions and the isolation faced by women home workers in developing countries, or the sexualisation of women's bodies through international prostitution and associated trafficking. Another critic might focus on the universal rights in employment, which may have different implications for men and women, given the unequal distribution of domestic and reproductive labour. Some would argue that the equal employment rights for men and women should involve a transformation in childcare arrangements, for example. Without such a transformation, other rights for equal rights may actually end up perpetuating inequalities, while international organisations such as international labour organisations, the ILO, exist to prevent trafficking and forced labour and to ensure women workers' rights. They cannot sanction states directly, even if they are contravention of their obligations as signatories. Ultimately, universal human rights are seen to be made in the image of man, and women's rights are not guaranteed in their promotion, thus invalidating any claim to universality. Who can claim against whom? What is the rights are claimed for a group that are not recognised, such as a rebel group, or against a group that is not held morally accountable, such as a transnational company? It is not always possible to bring non-state actors to account, as they do not necessarily sign up to the principles of universal rights. Also, international NGOs, such as Amnesty International and Oxfam, are unregulated and not held accountable to the wider public. This angle might also focus on the compatibility of different rights. For example, are political, social, economic, and legal rights compatible with each other? Some states have been known to argue that they need to promote economic growth and stability first before granting political rights. For some cash-strapped states, each basic social and economic rights might not be attainable. Individual human rights trumping state sovereignty. This relates to the third area outlined above. Do human rights take precedence over state sovereignty? The human-centered logic of rights regards human rights as a value which places legitimate constraints upon the politics of national self-interest and interstate competition. Chandler notes that at 1993 UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, the UN Charter was quickly construed to mean the human rights should take precedence over sovereignty. Moreover, he argues that by the end of 1990, the UN protectorates established in Kosovo and East Timor and the indictment of former Yugoslavia President Slobodan Milosevic for war crimes. International relations were no longer seen to be dominated by the need for interstate consensus. The expansion of responsibility to protect from the mid-2000s further embedded the place of rights over unlimited sovereignty. Understanding human rights in the global arena. Communitarian versus cosmopolitan approaches, page 205. This brings us to debate about how relations between states should be constructed and regulated. So, we can ask whether relations between states should be driven by the universal moral principles, such as rights, or by other interests. This is articulated through the debate between cosmopolitan and communitarian approaches, considered as normative theories as opposed to analytical theories, such as realism and liberalism. By normative, we are not dealing with what is or what exists in an empirical sense, but what ought to be, and the choices that decision makers should take. There are two different and sharply contrasting views about how the international arena can be theorized. should be organised and can be described. The communitarian side sees the international sphere as a make-up of as plurality of interacting cultures with inconsumable values, while the cosmopolitan side deploys general concepts of rights and applies these to humanity as a whole. The descriptions offered here are given a broad umbrella positions, and there are differences within each side, as will be seen in the subsequent section, but for reasons of clarity and simplicity, communitarianism can be viewed as a champion and particularist and a state-centric perspective, while cosmopolitanism maintains a universalist and a global perspective. These two constructions rest upon very different views of what human beings are and how they do and should interact together. Communitarians understand human beings first in terms of their cultural identity, while according to the cosmopolitans, reason should be governing principle of human interaction. Though this is not always the case, the cosmopolitan belief in the emancipatory power of the human capacity for reasoning derives from the idea that reasoning is a shared capacity capable of providing the basis for moral principles which aim to deliver humankind from the mire of ignorance and superstition, as you can no doubt appreciate. These are strongly divergent principles of which to base the construction of international politics. For communitarians, the international arena is dominated by states, but this does not discount the role played by other subordinate actors to help coordinate interstate activity. International NGOs, international regulatory organisations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, the UN as a forum for states, and global civil society campaigns such as the campaign to end apartheid in South Africa or anti-globalisation protests can all play a role, provided that states are still regarded as essential. As stated by cosmopolitans, the international arena is a public sphere and potentially an arena of governance in its own right. Some cosmopolitans look forward to a global order with a strong set of institutions above states. Areas identified as requiring reform include the compositions of the UN Security Council and the power of veto by permanent members, and the restrictions on international intervention arising from the UN Charter and from state sovereign. The form of accountability that supranational institutions would have, how that accountability would be delivered, and to whom, remain in question, however. You might be starting to recognise how this ties in with the block-wide theme of globalisation and the effects this has on global politics. Which set of rights should such a global order be governed by? We have already seen how human rights discourse represents a specific cultural tradition. Therefore, can these rights be considered as truly universal? We'll now look at issues of culture, rights, and globalisation, while keeping in mind the two perspectives that you have been introduced to above and the variations within them. Page 207, Cultural Rights and Globalisation. Having examined human rights at a global level and looked at different perspectives on how they should be applied, we can now further explore how global propagation of rights relates to local cultural traditions and what the responses have been. On the one hand, the existence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it demonstrates human rights are indeed globally accepted. On the other hand, the universal scope of human remains contested. Why might this be the case? In reality, do all people and nations subscribe to the same notion of rights? The global rights discourse, cosmopolitanism, and cultural globalisation. One of the issues of debate is that the predominant discourse around human rights represents a particular cultural tradition. According to this view, they are very much an outcome of European and North American historical struggles. The states in the West that promote this view also propagate a secularized culture, which is nevertheless nor necessarily incompatible with religious traditions. in this interpretation of human rights are not universal good, but propagate or even impose a particular cultural tradition. As you have already seen in chapter 17, economic globalization is often related to spreading the Western lifestyles and cosmopolitan preferences across the world. Some of the popular expressions of this culture fall out of economic globalization and McDonaldization and Coca-Colaization of the world. These concepts suggest that economic globalization produces a global homogeneous consumer culture, and the Western models increasingly displace alternative cultural traditions. However, this is only one way of understanding cultural globalization. Cultural, cultural homogenization contains several aspects: propagation of lifestyles, clothing, music, and consumer products from the West. And the most visible and striking, but aside from McDonald's and Coca-Cola's effects, uniformization also progresses through the propagation of a set of norms and values, such as human rights. Last 2 pages, let's do it. Democracy, market economy, and protection of environment, while are imposed in all corners of the earth. The later aspect that is the globalization propagation and a set of norms and values introduced an important element of in the discussion of cultural globalization. It implies that cultural globalization cannot be reduced to consumption patterns and lifestyles, but more importantly, it indicates that cultural globalization cannot be reduced to the side effect of economic globalization. It is a development in its own right that is partly independent of economic processes. The globalization of rights, especially of human rights, but increasingly also of property rights. It has provoked a debate about the cultural content of rights. Do they impose Western value systems upon other value systems in the world? It is often argued that universal human rights mainly incorporate Western traditions that prioritize individual freedom rights and individual property rights above family rights, rights of the community, and social rights. The underlying assumption in this debate is that the global rights have specific cultural content. They are not natural rights that everyone gains at birth. Instead, the debate about rights versus cultural assumes that universal rights originate from particular cultural histories that prioritize particular values such as individual freedoms, market interaction, individual property, and so on. By imposing rights globally, one can indeed argue that one is not simply favouring particular rights, but enforcing a cultural tradition and its values upon their other traditions. They may not wish to prioritise the right of free speech and movement above, for instance, equal distribution of wealth. Rights as expressions of cultural values are the first and most obvious way in which rights relate to culture. However, rights are also cultural and significantly different through not unrelated sense. They express a right culture. But what does it mean to walk a rights culture? The concept of rights culture refers to the idea that rights systems are culture in another sense of the word. And the heart of the concept of rights culture is the idea that claiming rights requires a specific way of understanding how one relates to oneself, to other people, and to wider community. Individuals are first of or understood as rights holders. They define themselves and are defined by others on the basis of rights they hold. For example, under the Geneva Convention, refugees are defined as persons who, owning to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion. United Nations, no date, Art 1, have a right of not being sent back to the country where they were persecuted. It is worth nothing here, and the rights culture, in this sense, has strong links with a liberal philosophical and political tradition that has discussed in blocks 2 and 3. Liberalism can be seen as an individualistic and un-universalistic doctrine with a particular concern to uphold individual liberties with regard to the state and individuals' rights to own property. To a great extent, supporters of rights culture operating in a close relationship with liberal political tradition. And thus, the notion of universal human rights are centred on a Western and arguably US understanding of human rights, with no reference of other cultural values. Contested 2011. 𝒰𝓃𝒹𝒄𝓃𝒹 2005. When we think about the cosmopolitan approach, as discussed previously, it is therefore easy to see parallels with the universal claims for the rights of cosmopolitan might promote and the Western liberal traditions that it draws upon. This is often referred to as liberal cosmopolitanism, and while it can be seen as being historically predominant in the global rights discourse, it is not the only cosmopolitan viewpoint, is it? Indeed, as Shani 2014 highlights, although the institutional rights may have its roots in Western Europe, the content of rights is a tradition, namely freedom and equality, has just as deep, if not deeper roots in many non-Western cultures. Buddhism, Hinduism and Islam all arguably have the idea of freedom and equality at their cores too. In a similar vein, scholars drawing from and working in the post-colonial theory, a position that emphasises and analyses the legacies of colonialism, is have criticised the way in which liberal cosmopolitanism reinforces unequal power relationships at the global level. The viewpoint emphasises the promulgation of rights discourse as part of a renewed form of imperialism forced on poorer states, many of which were former colonies, might, for example, have to subscribe to Western defined norms in order to survive, even if they reinforce dependency and inequality. Therefore, rather than basing cosmopolitanism on shared adherence to Western defined liberal values, scholars such as 𝒟𝒽𝒾𝓃𝒾𝓃 2007 and Duffield 2007 emphasise the need for a different kind of cosmopolitan thinking that focuses on solidarity with the poor and universal principles emanating from below, rather than through the largesse of the Western democracies. Page 210, my old friend. That's how we do. That is how we do. Page 210. Not bad, my old sailor. I want to try and get